What if the truth of cinema was never meant to be found in what studios released, but in the pieces they buried before the world could see them? The early 90s were a strange intersection of ambition and fear, a moment when action films were made faster than they could be understood, and where the editing room quietly became the most powerful weapon in Hollywood. Behind the neon lights, behind the gun smoke, behind the straight-to-video boom that promised limitless freedom, there were cuts made for reasons no trailer ever admitted. Some films were rewritten after the final shot. Some were stripped of their identity before the credits rolled. Some carried the scars of the battles their creators fought in silence. It was a decade shaped not just by the films that survived, but by the versions that didn't. The films that were trimmed, softened, reshaped, or quietly pushed aside not because they failed, but because they revealed something the system wasn't ready to face. 5 titles, 5 stories, 5 battles fought in rooms without windows. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1: Intent to Kill, 1992. It begins with a promise the film could never fully keep. A lone cop in a city drowning in its own shadows, a story meant to cut deeper than the action formulas of its time. Intent to Kill arrived in 1992 as another entry in the tidal wave of urban thrillers, but something in its construction always felt unsettled, as if the final product was only half of what the filmmakers intended. Directed by Charles T. Kanganis and led by Traci Lords in one of her most intense dramatic turns, the film was shaped during a moment when video market productions were growing faster than anyone could control. It had the look of a story that wanted to push past convention, leaning into the grit of street-level justice and the bleakness of a city that seemed beyond saving. Early marketing painted it as hard-edged and uncompromising, the kind of thriller that didn't blink. Posters highlighted its danger. Trailers leaned on tension rather than spectacle. But the finished film carries the unmistakable fingerprints of a production that was pushed, trimmed, and refitted in the edit. Several sequences rumored to be more brutal were reportedly softened or removed to avoid distribution hurdles. Choreographed confrontations were tightened not for pacing but for tone, as if someone feared the rawness would limit its market. Supporting characters were scaled back, their arcs reduced to fragments that hint at something larger that never made it to screen. Even the score feels reworked, shifting abruptly in moments where emotional beats should have unfolded naturally. The result is a film caught between what it wanted to be and what it was allowed to become. You can sense the version that might have existed sharper, darker, more honest, flickering beneath the edits, a reminder that some stories aren't hidden because they fail, but because they aim too close to something true. Film 2: Cybertracker, 1994. It opens like a prophecy delivered in static, a future where justice is automated, where the line between man and machine dissolves, and where truth depends on whoever programs the system. Cybertracker arrived in 1994, riding the wave of techno-fear that defined the decade, and yet the film's final form feels strangely stitched together, as if the wires beneath its metal surface were rearranged at the last moment. Directed by Richard Pepin and fronted by Don the Dragon Wilson, the film had an ambition bigger than its budget. It wanted to play in the same arena as Terminator and RoboCop, borrowing the visual grammar of dystopian action and infusing it with the martial arts charisma of its leading man. Trailers leaned heavily on its cybernetic themes, presenting it as a sleek, dangerous vision of a future gone wrong. The marketing promised a polished sci-fi thriller, the kind that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the bigger films it echoed. But the truth buried behind its production is far more revealing. As filming continued, the team reportedly faced pressure to reshape scenes to fit a more marketable template, resulting in reshoots designed to highlight explosions and hand-to-hand combat rather than the darker societal commentary initially planned. Visual effects sequences were shortened or re-edited when they exceeded the post-production budget, leaving certain story beats feeling abruptly resolved. There were whispers of early cuts that leaned heavier into the unsettling question of whether technology should ever hold absolute authority, a theme softened in the final version. Even the Cybertracker itself, meant to be a symbol of unchecked power, was redesigned mid-production to appear less disturbing and more toyetic for international distributors. What remains is a film constantly negotiating its identity, torn between the future it wanted to warn us about and the safer, cleaner narrative it was reshaped into. Underneath the explosions and neon circuitry lies the shadow of a story that once aimed higher, reminding us that sometimes the most interesting version of a film is the one we're never allowed to see. Film 3 Hard Justice, 1995. It begins with the sound of metal doors closing, a noise that feels less like a transition and more like a verdict. Hard Justice entered the action landscape of 1995 as another prison-set thriller, yet the film carries the unmistakable tension of a project reshaped by forces far beyond the frame. Its world of concrete corridors and desperate alliances was meant to feel suffocating, but something in the final cut suggests a deeper struggle behind the camera. Starring David Bradley and directed by Greg Yaitanes, the film positioned itself as a fierce, grounded portrait of corruption and survival inside an institution built on violence. Early promotional material promised something rawer than mainstream action, leaning into its claustrophobic setting and the physicality of its cast. The surface story was simple: a hero wrongfully condemned, a prison ruled by fear, and a system that crushes anyone who dares to resist. For audiences hungry for no-nonsense action, it seemed to deliver exactly what the genre demanded. But beneath the surface lies a production shaped by caution, compromise, and unexpected intervention. According to those close to the project, the earliest cut was significantly darker, exploring the psychological decay of incarceration with scenes that pushed the boundaries of its limited budget. However, distributors reportedly insisted on reducing several sequences that portrayed the brutality of prison life too directly, leading to edits that softened the oppressive tone the filmmakers originally pursued. Entire character arcs were narrowed, supporting roles trimmed, and moments of emotional weight compressed to maintain a runtime acceptable for video market programming. Even the climactic confrontations were modified, recut to emphasize clearer heroes and villains rather than the morally blurred world the script first explored. The finished film retains flashes of its original ambition, but you can feel the ghosts of the scenes that once gave it sharper teeth. It stands as a reminder that sometimes the harshest justice in cinema isn't delivered on screen, but in the editing room, where the story you intended is traded for the story they believe will sell. Film 4. The Expert, 1995. It starts with a contradiction that would define the entire film. A story built on precision and control, released into a process that would quickly spiral beyond anyone's grasp. The Expert stepped into 1995 as a revenge-driven action thriller led by Jeff Speakman, promising sharp choreography, a focused narrative, and the discipline of a hero shaped by loss. But behind the facade of efficiency lies one of the most quietly chaotic post-production histories of its era. Directed at least in spirit by William Lustig, the film was conceived with a far darker tone. Early cuts reportedly leaned into a world where violence had consequences, justice was never clean, and the line between vengeance and obsession blurred with each step. Speakman, known for his disciplined intensity, anchored the story in a grounded emotional struggle rather than simple spectacle. Marketing materials sold the film as tight and relentless, the kind of no-nonsense action piece that spoke directly to fans of the early 90-seconds video boom. Yet the version audiences eventually saw was not the film its original creators envisioned. Studio executives, concerned about marketability, intervened heavily in the editing process. Scenes emphasizing psychological tension were trimmed or restructured. Certain character motivations were simplified to create a clearer moral divide. Action sequences were rearranged to appear more conventional, dampening the slower, moodier rhythms Lustig favored. The most telling sign of conflict came when the director removed his name from the final product, leaving behind a film whose identity had been altered so thoroughly that its own architect no longer wished to claim it. What remains on screen is a film divided against itself, its clean edges hiding the fractures beneath. You can sense the original version in the spaces where atmosphere abruptly gives way to formula, where moral ambiguity dissolves into safer beats. The Expert is a testament to how a story can be reshaped in silence, leaving behind an echo of the film it might have been. Film 5 Catchfire, 1990. It begins with a disappearance not inside the film but around it. Catchfire is one of the rare titles where the story behind the camera overshadows the one unfolding on screen, a work shaped as much by conflict as by creativity. Released in 1990, it was intended to be an intimate, dangerous thriller directed by Dennis Hopper, starring Jodie Foster in a role built around fear, obsession, and the uneasy intimacy between hunter and hunted. But almost every frame carries the weight of a struggle that no marketing campaign dared to reveal. On the surface, Catchfire was presented as a stylish neo-noir, a chase story wrapped in smoky colors and tense silences. Posters emphasized Foster's intensity, Hopper's unpredictability, and the seductive danger of two lives forced together. The trailer suggested a grounded, psychological thriller, the kind that lingers more in the mind than in the pulse. But from its opening weekend, critics sensed something fractured, a film that felt strangely incomplete and conspicuously uneven. The truth ran much deeper. Hopper, who poured himself into the project, clashed repeatedly with the studio over tone, pacing, and the film's thematic daring. His vision pushed for a slower, more atmospheric descent into obsession, while the studio demanded a brisker, more commercial thriller. When tensions escalated beyond repair, entire sections of Hopper's preferred cut were removed, softening the abrasive edges he believed were essential to the story. Nearly 40 minutes vanished from the theatrical release, reshaping characters, motivations, and emotional through lines. The conflict grew so intense that Hopper ultimately removed his name from the film, leaving behind the infamous pseudonym Alan Smithy, a silent signature of artistic defeat. In the years since, longer cuts have resurfaced, offering glimpses of the film Hopper intended, versions that breathe, linger, and challenge far more boldly than the one audiences first saw. It stands today as a reminder that sometimes the most revealing story isn't the one on the screen, but the one that was taken from it. Bonus fact: The Hotspot, 1990, there is a film that rarely appears in discussions of lost cuts or studio-altered visions, not because it lacked ambition, but because its disappearance was almost complete. The Hotspot, 1990, directed by Dennis Hopper in the same restless period that produced Catchfire, stands as a quiet echo of how fragile creative intent can be when the system begins to tighten around it. On the surface, it arrived as a sultry neo-noir, a slow burn of temptation and betrayal that prized mood over momentum. But like so many films of its era, the version audiences eventually saw was not the one first shaped in the editing room. Early accounts from those close to the production describe a cut that leaned heavily into the film's oppressive sensuality, a version that allowed silence to build tension and shadow to swallow certainty. Hopper's original structure reportedly embraced ambiguity, letting the moral decay of its characters unfold with unsettling patience. But distributors, wary of a film that refused to move at the pace they expected, requested a series of trims that gradually reshaped the tone. A handful of scenes meant to deepen the psychological stakes were shortened. Subplots hinting at the darker motives of certain characters were softened. Moments designed to suffocate the viewer with dread were tightened to feel more conventional. What remains is still compelling, but those who glimpsed the earlier cut speak of a version richer in atmosphere, heavier in consequence, a film that trusted its audience to sit inside its discomfort. Like a whisper swallowed by larger voices, the original rhythm was lost, leaving behind only traces of the film Hopper meant it to be. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail.